Hey, good morning. Good Yom Tov. Hope everybody had a meaningful Yom Kippur. So we resume Ayin Beis, volume 3. We reached the top of page 1247. The end of the paragraph. In the last class, before Yom Kippur, we gave an overview of the entire progression of the maturation process, the maturity of and growth and development of intellect and emotions in context of Avodas Hashem particularly. And we reach now levels that we're talking here now, where in the highest levels of the mind and emotional development, we're speaking about Binah, the two levels in Binah, one as it serves as a mother that nurtures and hovers over its offspring, its midas, the emotions. The contemplation is essentially taming, directing, guiding. And then Binah, as it's in a zivug, that's a zivug she'eina shalom, not a complete zivug union with Chochmah, because the mother is more involved with the emotions, looking down, so to speak, to her emotions. And then there's zivug shalom, where Binah is catapulted, the midas themselves, as they develop, shlach tishlach hasa'im, where the mother, Binah, goes back to an equal stature with zivug shalom, complete union with Chochmah, and both together. Shalach to shalach, what I said, shlach tishlach, shalach to shalach, esaim, and they both stand together, gazing at histaklus al mitzcha, the arechampin, on the forehead of arechampin, which is the ratzon of the divine. But they're gazing at it with a full contemplation of Chacham and Binah at their best. And in turn, from the metzach of arechampin draws, as he said, from the shin, ayin, neher, the 370 energies or lights, from Atik, from Tainug. So though they don't experience Tainug directly, because it's the Metzach, but nevertheless, as we just learned the last lines, he actually said that the Avazub b'chinas haratzonu badrega achas b'chinas ava b'tainugim, she b'chinas hatainug. It's the same level. However, it's not revealed. So it's equal, so it's in the same level as Atik, but it's not revealed only in the Metzach. And that's why, as he explained, as we discussed in the last class at length, that the Ava, which is burning like a fire, does not remain in that state of expiration, Kleis HaNefesh, but rather comes down in a shuv to focus on, because of its bittul is so deep, that it's not just focused on its own powerful thirst, intense thirst, but also, and more than thirst. He called it Cheles Ava and Kleis HaNefesh, all the three levels, but it returns shuv to fulfill the purpose for which the neshama was created, which is to come down and draw that and draw down that passion and that divine revelation into this world. As he explains at end of, as he explains chapter 50 in Tanya in Ayin Beis here on top of page 1247, bottom of 1246 and top of 1247. Okay. So I'm going to continue now from there. The new paragraph on page 1247. I will mention again that the ideas that were discussed are based on many different places, but especially the last section was shalach to shalach hasa'im, and the whole idea of shiluach hakan, the two stages, is primarily based on the Maimorim of the Tzemach Tzedek, which cites also that essentially the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe on Kan Sipur, the bird's nest, which is a name for the Maimor Ki Yikar Kan Sipur, which is talking about the whole story of Shiluach HaKan and Pasha Kiseitzei. And a lot of the details are taken from there, but they're far more developed in Ayin Beis. There's some places it's exact language, but mostly it's really the Rebbe Rashab explaining it in much more detail and length.
It's
so just
can
record.
sipo.
Okay. Now,
it's can sipo, not can sipo.
What did I say? Can
sipo.
I think it said can. He correct can sipo lefonecho.
I think so too.
Okay.
We can look it up. Yeah, I think it says can. Okay, so so let's continue here. V'alpizeh yuvan. We're going to start now. Yeah. So top of page 1247. If you want to follow the pages, the text. If you don't have it, it's at ayinbeis.com. The PDFs of all these pages are there. Okay. So now, remember, we haven't finished yet tying it all together. Bina is b'chol ma'idecha. And b'chol ma'idecha, we learned there are two levels. B'chol ma'idecha, like on page 1245. B'chol ma'idecha, in contrast to chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha, it spills over. It's ma'idecha. And it's a very expansive passion of love, passionate love. And it's from atzmius hanefesh, not through expression, through seichel that defines words like tzaikus hakol, but it's still a voice. There's a sound. Compares it to that. There's still his galus beliba beispailus, and he said, and therefore it's called ha'ara or chitzenius of etzem hanefesh. And then b'chol me'idecha, that's one level b'chol me'idecha. And the second higher level b'chol me'idecha on the bottom of page 1245 is when completely atzmis nefesh, complete bittul, with the exact opposite happens. Instead of the love being an expansive, passionate, and very loud, so to speak, intense love, it comes into a point where it completely gets nullified. And like he said, in a term of bittul, because now the moichin is getting involved as well. A person is concentrating on something that is negei b'chayev mamash, shechayev tluyim b'y negei ad hanefesh, mamish. Till now, that was an emotional expression. So in other words, the lower level of b'chol me'idecha is primarily emotional. And the higher level is all-consuming. The entire person is involved. So the first level, technically, you could also have a person who doesn't yet have the full appreciation in their mind. So it's a high level of expression of love. But like he said, in the page 1246, he explained the difference that a person could have it, but they don't have the full das, amokas hadas, and concentration and personalization and recognition of the power of this experience. And that's why it's with Rash and Ispilus. It has expression and so on. Someone that does have it, it far more transforms them. It shakes them to the core. And yet expression-wise, it's not as expressive because it's far more internal, as he explained. So that's why it doesn't even have expression of sound. It's the core. It's the primius of atzmius, which is all what we learned in the previous. I'm just summing it up because he's going to come back now to explain. Remember that we still have two questions that are hanging. The two questions that he asked on the page 1243 and 1244. Question number one, what's the connection of Bina to B'chol Me'idecha? Bina is limited. It's hasaga. Its comprehension has its parameters. B'chol Me'idecha is bli gvul. And even though the Zohar says Bina is B'chol Me'idecha, what's the explanation? The Zohar says it doesn't have a shiur, but how do you explain that? And the second question is B'chol Me'idecha expansive or reductive? In other words, is it expansive love, expression, which would seem to be the case? B'chol levavcha chol nafshecha is a limited expression of love. B'chol me'idecha is complete expansion and expression. Or is it like what he called from the Zohar, the level, the nekuda, the les b'chivra, kamei begav the chika the rechime azir is garmei, that he becomes completely nullified, as if like he's non-existent. Like the klei sanefesh we talked about. Semoyin, and that's a good way to say it. Semoyin is a very loud expression. A person is thirsty, you see it. They're passionate and they're thirsty and longing and so on. Klei sanefesh is a state where you're already completely bottled to being encompassed inside the source. So Klesa Nefesh is deeper. And Shemayim is the outer dimension. So how do we explain that? Even though we could already speculate the answer, but he's going to spell it out. So in other words, because basically it's going to be 2 levels in Binah and 2 levels of B'chol Meidecha. That's the answer ultimately. That there's a level where it's expansive, like thirst, and there's a level where it becomes completely consumed, and therefore it's like a nekuda, a point. But still, let's see how the Rebbe Rashab actually spells it out. So now he continues on top of page 1247. Valpizeh Yuvan, and according to what we've learned until now, will be understood. The Avad the B'chol Meidecha shaykh lebchinas Binah. How is B'chol Meidecha connected and relate to Binah? As he asked back on page 1243, just for the context. Because it's dafka through Binah, which is that he delved deeply into with his mind and his thought process. It's dafka through that causes the longing and the absorption, the kiloin, the completely being consumed and being absorbed. Like you said, because when you don't have Binah yet, like you said, you can have an emotional awakening in B'chol Meidecha, but it's primarily emotional, and it doesn't reach that level of atzmis of. So here, before I continue, it's critical to point this out. And we've talked about this many times, but it always comes back to this in the interface of Ayin Beis, the theme. On one hand, seichel, we know clearly, is not etzem. Because seichel is already an expression, it's an understanding. Like we say, les machshava tfisa beklal. No thought can grasp God. The languages that you have. I mean, there's no, even when you talk about greatness of God, like we learned earlier, it's also, even greatness is nullified. So God is beyond seichel. At the same time, you see clearly how the Rebbe Rashab, Chassidus in general, wants the mind to bring us to a point of appreciating that itself. So it seems like a contradiction in terms. If seichel is a powerful tool. No one argues that point. It's a powerful instrument. It allows you to comprehend and understand things. I mean, seichel is like the key thing that makes a human being. That we're not just emotional, subjective creatures. We're not just focused on survival and our own self-interest, but that we have the capacity to understand and to relate to each other and communicate and reason and negotiate. In other words, its ability to reason, it gives the human being the ability of moyach shalat alalev. But Chassidus goes a lot further, as I discussed. Seichel really is God's gift. It's a godly force that he wanted to embed within our structures, within our infrastructure, an instrument that doesn't just let us understand that you shouldn't be a selfish person and you should be godly, but it lets us actually reach with the mind, imagine and understand things that are far beyond our subjective interests. So Binah and Chochmah for sure, but even Binah in its own way, through its concentration, ultimately Binah is just expressing godliness. So when you go Mamata Lamaila, Binah begins as a comprehension. You understand things, you develop it, you flesh it out. Just like Chochmah has the element of the Nekudas HaChochmah. But the truth is, the real goal of intelligence is to take you to a place that's beyond intelligence. Now, what does that mean? That Binah is actually rooted in higher levels, except we, as I said initially, we hold on to it through our minds and through our intellect and through our logical reasoning and logical evaluations and so on. But the truth is, the goal is that Binah should lead us to that experience it in the fullest sense of the word. Now you could say, what do you need Binah for, Chachma? You can just rely on the emotional connection. Every soul is connected to God. Every soul has a natural Ava Misrateres, hidden love to God, like he explains in chapter 18 in Tanya and on. That's what he says. He starts that in addition to everything we discussed till chapter 18, there's also an Ava, a concealed love within each Jew, within each neshama. And then he goes on to say how to access it and so on. So why do you need to have the whole contemplation part? Why do you need 17 chapters in Tanya till there? And the answer is twofold. First of all, that's natural. It's still what natural. It's not permeates you as a human being completely. It's your last and natural love. You were born with it. Number one, it's not beprimius. It's like a person has a muna pshuta. Simple amuna. They don't need to work on that. You're born with it. Ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. Every child has that. And the goal is that it should become part of who you are. B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. You can't just say, I'll have Yom Kippur all year round, and I'll come etzem nefesh connects to etzem of godliness. Because we're beings that exist in this world and want to be internalized, which leads to the second point, like we learned just now, you want a dira b'tachtenim. For dira b'tachtenim, you need to bring it down into the structure of existence. You can't just rely on etzem ha'ava, on atzmis. The goal is that it should bring the etzem into tachtenim. That's what you want. The etzem of godliness and the etzem on nefesh should come into tachtenim, into giluyim. So the seichel, and that's actually in Tanya, he begins first with, he doesn't begin with etzem on nefesh. He says, but after that, it's all about his bonus. You contemplate on God's greatness, and that leads to ava v'yira, yira v'ava, moyach shalat alalev. You're working as a perik tazayin, which he's quoted earlier, that you use your mind to appreciate godliness, and even though you don't feel it yet, at least also the thing is you feel it's beautiful, it's appropriate to love God, and then you come to higher levels. In other words, we work from the bottom up. But then there's another side. You have an etzem nefesh, you have that for core love. So Binah and Chachma and Binah, but now he's talking about Binah more, both serve the purpose of being an interface between the structure of Seichel, and therefore the structure of existence and of the human being, as well as experiencing and sensing a reality that's beyond the structure. So they become the ultimate interface in the language of Kabbalah or even Ayin Beis between Keser and the rest of the spheres. So you can't just jump to Keser. You need to have a bridge, an interface. So that's why just the natural love is a very powerful level, like he said, but it's still not atzmius mamish. And atzmius mamish paradoxically comes when you do apply yourself. Like the difference between two people that say their lives are in danger, a child and an adult, a mature adult. So both, it's negei b'etzem nefesh. They both feel danger. Their very lives are dependent on it. But the child will just react emotionally in a panic. And the adult will, what he said, he'll apply his mind. So his whole being is immersed in it. So the same thing in the Nimshal, in the example, it's not just an emotional connection to God. Let's say, for example, when the Eden left Mitzrayim, or any miracle happens. So someone who's not contemplating, is not using Chachma and Binah and Ma'amik Machshav, of course appreciates it and thanks God for saving my life, for taking us out of Egypt. But then let's imagine a Moshe Rabbeinu, or someone who has a full understanding or a deep understanding of what God did. Their appreciation and their connection is going to be a lot deeper than just a natural, instinctive love to God, to your Father who saved you, because he has also the deeper appreciation that really it allows it to internalize it. And the second point, as I said, to make a dira b'tachtenim. So this is critical to the whole point here, because he's saying that to come to this level, chesed v'chilayin, like I said, you could argue, one second, you can come to that by just awakening your natural love. Why do you need a big binah? Like we said earlier, all you need to know, your Father is in your presence. You don't need a deep hisbonenus. You may not be aware, so the seichel makes you aware. Your Father is Avinu, is Ki'ato Avinu. He's in your presence. So therefore, there's a natural love, but it's not going to lead to chesed v'kilayin as to the highest levels without that hisbonenus. Now, in Perek Mem Daled in Tanya, he says it explicitly. He says even when you reach the level of Ava Rabbah, which is like Ava B'Tainugim, as he explains there. Even when you reach a level where you appreciate that God is your Father and is your sustenance, and you will really appreciate it, it still needs, he says, Avas Olam, which is the Ava that comes through contemplation. Because that, he says, causes the fire to really burn very passionately. And then he continues, and also because that's what internalizes it, and that comes that you know God. It's not just it's not just enough to love God, but you also know God. So when you say v'yadaita ayim v'shavesa levavecha, you could argue, what is the role of v'yadaita ayim? And this is, of course, the operative verse that he's using here. What's the role of v'yadaita ayim? You could say, you know what, v'yadaita ayim is only to get the lev awakened, since the heart may be blind or may be distracted. So v'yadaita ayim v'yadiyas Hashem, that leads you to, no, wake up, Hashem is in your presence. But no, v'yadaita ayim is a whole process of its own. That's what limud Chassidus is. Daas and Binah, a whole process of learning about godliness in a depth, in detail, as we do. Look at Ayin Beis itself. And because there, as I said, that number one, to be able to permeate the individual completely, b'pnimius, and number two, it permeates the structure of existence, the dir b'tachtenim that's necessary in this whole process, in understanding this process. So in that sense, what you have here is, okay, I also mentioned that some of the Talmidei HaMagid, some of the colleagues of the Alter Rebbe, opposed his approach because they felt that the Baal Shem Tov came and the Magid came to teach. The main thing is etzem hanefesh, the kukuriku, just ignite the core soul. And the Alter Rebbe turned it into a whole system. So for them, the system seemed to be taking away from the etzem. We were back to a contemplation. But they were incorrect because the Alter Rebbe wasn't coming to do that. The Alter Rebbe was using contemplation to connect to the etzem, not to go away from the etzem. Yes, it's true. Seichel could conceal the etzem. When a person has a munah pshuta, just simple faith, and the intelligence sometimes blocks that faith. But the goal is to have both qualities, both faith and complete internalization, because faith alone ends up being not complete pnimius, and also makivdik. Like we know, Ganva Apu Machtarta, Rachmana Kari is the best example. The Ganav that prays to God to succeed, to steal. What does that mean? Because his Amunah is there. He has the Etzem an Neshama, the Etzem, the Amunah Pshuta. But it's not permeated. So he can do something that's the dissonance. He can do something inconsistent because the Amunah is there, but it's not become part of who the whole person is. Which for that, you need to have Chabad and Chagas, not just Nihi, not just action-based. Not just a munah pshuta that turns into action. You need a person to be completely permeated and infused with the divine, with that faith and with that munah pshuta and the etzem hanefesh. And that's why he's speaking. That's why it's so critical. This hamoke b'meiche b'machshavte. Remember again, we're not talking about hamoke b'meiche b'machshavte to learn a piece of Gemara or even a piece of Chassidus. We're learning emek machshavte to something that's negei b'nefesh. That's critical to remember here. So it's emek machshavte plus the shechayev tluyim b'v'negei ad nefesh mamish. We're talking about the level b'chol meidecha. We're not just talking about a deep contemplation alone. So it's where the midas and where the natural love and the seichel meet and are able to catapult the person. The midas catapult the person to a completely higher level, all the way to arech and atik. The dafke, I'm continuing to read now. The dafke bebchin is pnimius ha'atzmius, and not just ma'ikei machshavte that reaches case of iklayim, should also be a level of tzimoyin, of thirst. So bedavke pnimius ha'atzmius, not chitzenius ha'atzmius. Shezo dafke bebchin is kiloyin, bebchin is bittul kol metziusei. This we discussed. This was the whole discussion on the last page. So that the pnimius ha'atzmius that bebchin is kiloyin, bebchin is bittul kol metziusei. That he completely expires, or you can say faints, or chiloin from the word languish, some use the word sometimes. No, you completely become feeble and weak, like weak at the feet, as they say, weak in the knees, because you lose yourself. And bittul comments you say, shezeh inyan kenekuda de lesba chivra, v'hu megav de chika de rechimo de leyochla lemizbel. So he's going back now to that first point where he asked that question, which one is it? Is the ava b'chol meidecha expansive? Or reductive, meaning complete bittul. So that's what he says, that we're talking on the higher level now. That becomes like a nekuda, the lesla chivra. The nesba chivra does not have color, does not have, we say chivras, does not have expression. That's the dechiko, the pressure, the tension of love the pressure, the chikul, like when you feel completely like deichik, but not due to feeling constraints like min hameitzer. He made it clear earlier that it's not due to
squeeze.
Yeah, you feel squeezed, but he said clearly, I just want to refer to you to a line that he said that it's not squeezed like min hameitzer, where you feel like a negative, like constraints, like being in golus. In hameitzer, he said that somewhere before. I can't find it right now. Oh yeah, here on page 1245, it says, "Ein zeh sheba min hameitzer, ki mitzad hahergish de'erein sof shenirgish benafshe." So we're talking here a level where you're feeling in a positive way. You're feeling completely overwhelmed. It cannot contain. It's so powerful, it cannot contain. The level of love, that has till semayin, it's true, it's a thirst. It's outside of your boundaries. But there's still you that's experiencing some thirst. Here, completely loses himself in this experience. Va'ava and a love of this nature, he dafka this is dafka when there's maimik mechem achshavte. You can't come to it just through to a natural love. The natural love will lead you to recognizing godliness and feeling thirsty and passionate and excited, and all that comes with that type of love. But to get to a love like this requires, like he said before, someone who's invested and completely understands the gravity of the situation of something that is negay benefesh mamish. And the reasoning for that is clearly because that completely consumes the whole person. He said earlier on page 1245, the first level, he says, does not affect the meichin. The meich is only there to make the heart aware. He said that very clearly. So therefore, it's not. I'm looking at the bottom of page 1245.
The meichin is not just seichel. It's not just seichel. It's much more than that.
No, but hamokas hadas. Like I said, we should look back. Das, hamokas hadas, which is the key word here. In a moment, he's going to explain about bina and das. Is it bina or das? But like he says in Tanya, the end of chapter 3, he says, without das, you can't really have the birth of midas. It'll only be dimyein shav. It'll only be delusional, because das is the hiskashrus. In other words, it's not just that I love my father, but I also fully appreciate, and I feel inside of me my real connection there. So it's not just a natural experience, it's also that level of personalization. That's why I said to go back, if you go back to Ayin Beis in volume 2, at page, I think it's 1175. Yeah. If you read the bottom of 1175, 1176, he talks very strongly about what das is. I'll just read a few words because I think it's important to understand. So he says like this. Hadasu shemekasher u'mechaber k'may v'adam yada. Das binds and connects. The harimidas hadas, the harimoyach hadas eine inyan hayidiyah v'asaga. The moyach of das is not just the inyan of knowing and understanding. Shezeh b'chinas chachma bina de chachma hu b'chinas yidiyah sadavar bina hi asaga sadavar. Chachma bina is the knowing and the understanding of something. The yidiyah shemechach baba bina b'chinas asaga. Hadasu is kashrus, and he says shemekasher beis dvarim, beis advarim. He explains either it's mekasher, is kashrus chachma and bina, it connects chachma and bina in a very tight bond, or is kashrus amechin and amidas. It's interesting, or it's a connection of the mind and the emotions.
Where are you reading?
The bottom of page 1275 in volume 2 in Ayin Beis. So now, remember the story that I think that Ashbat's Chassidim, older Chassidim would say, the difference between Semayin Tata. You can understand something, but not feel it's yours. The letter that in those days, you hired someone to read a letter, to read for you. So a person's father, unfortunately, passed away. He received a letter about it, but he couldn't read. So you hired someone to read, and they came to that passage, to that part where it said his father passed away, God forbid. The person reading continued to read. The person who was listening fainted. So they asked, what's going on here? He read it. He even knew about it and even understands it, but it's not his father. So Das is that it's my father. It's not just a nice idea. You can learn about Eidei and Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, or Chachma and Binah, or you can learn about Atzilus. You can learn about godliness, and you could say it's a beautiful idea, but is it mine? Do I own it? Is it my personal thing? So Das creates that personalization. That's why it's what he goes on to say here. Das actually carries an idea from a concept into an actualization. When you apply Chassidus, you're actually using Das. That's why children can have a lot of Chachma and Binah, but they don't yet have the maturity of Das. Das is an intimate connection with an idea. Not just I understand it, I got it. Or even I understand, even if you're a genius, you understand it brilliantly. And then he goes, and then he says, even in Seichel, so why then do you call Das Moichin? You should call Das a third thing, a separate entity. Chachma Binah is intelligence, and Das is another element that a human being needs to connect to that intelligence. So he says it's still called Meichin Shu Meich Shlishi, because even in Seichel, it also does, because you want Seichel itself to have this element. Shadasu Akodev Hargosha, the recognition and the feeling. So his Kashrus is the main thing of Das. But even in the world of Seichel, it forces you to now recognize, like in this case, the son, when he heard that the guy reading the letter and his father passed away, it not always, it's mine, I'm connected to it. But he recognized the gravity of it because it's his father. So you can have Seichel and it shouldn't be Hakar of Argosha. And and there's the Hakar of the Hargosha and the Seichel. So you're learning something about godliness, and then you come to say, oh, I sense how it's part of who I am. I sense my relationship with it. And that's the key that Das does to Chachma and Binah that causes there to be a hiskashus. Recognition. Because in Binah, I'll just read a few more lines. I think it's very helpful here. Bina is asaga levad. Now, bear in mind, he's not talking about Pnimius Bina here yet. We're going to soon see how Bina and Das come connected. But right now, he's talking about Bina in contrast to Das. So he says, and there the idea is still distant from him. He doesn't feel it in his inner sense. Again, Bina, we're talking the lower levels of Bina. That's why Bina is still makif. Even though it is comprehension, it's not makif like a muna, completely beyond. But in context of it's not a hergesh pnimi. You don't feel it as yours, an internal feeling. And he brings an example. That's why in Bina, you could understand something and accept something, even something that you dislike. Why? Because Bina is detached to some extent. So even something in Das, something you dislike, you don't want to have a relationship with. But Bina doesn't consider relationships. Bina is considering the idea itself. Someone says something to Bina, and your Bina understands it's something I hate. So Bina tells you, I hate this, but you still can relate to it, meaning understand it. When it comes to Das, it's personal. V'hadas hu hakoros hadover shemakir b'sichli shadover hukach. Shaydei zehu argosha shenirga she'ein b'pnimius. And he goes on to speak about it more at length. I'm not going to read it all right now. You can look it up yourself.
It is fascinating.
Hold on a second. 1 second. And then he goes on to explain what that means in Aveda. Hadas b'avedi hakodav argosha se'er eliki. And that's the Gili Benafshe. And that's why Das alikecha avicha, Yedaita yem. Das is so important. Again, not a Yediya Vasaga, but something of a intimate connection with it is. Now, 1 second, before you say anything. Now, of course, you could then say, 1 second here. That's good, Hamuksa Das. So why is Bina B'chol Ma'idech? You should say Das is B'chol Ma'idech. So the answer is going to be, he's not going to say it explicitly, but it's pretty clear. Take away Chachma and Bina, what are you connecting with? Das on its own doesn't have any substance. Das is when there's a father and a mother, like he says in Tanya, chapter 3. Abba ve'ima is chachma bina. Abba provides the seed. Ima provides the development of the idea. Okay? Das binds them together in an intimate place. It also binds Meichin and Midas, like we just learned. Take away Abba ve'ima, what do you have das? A skashus of what? What are you connecting? So Chachma and Bina gives the substance. They give the idea. Like if the letter wasn't read, the person wouldn't even know that the father passed away. God forbid. So you need to have the information. So Chachma and Bina provide, what are we talking about? What are we contemplating on? We're contemplating on godliness. We're contemplating on that's Dover Shechayev Tluyim Boy, on how a person is fundamentally connected to this, and this godliness is the Gei Ben Nefesh Mamish. And then the Das, Hamokas HaDas in that, creates that deeper, intimate connection, which leads to the Kleis HaNefesh that he's talking about, the total bittul. But the key thing we're going to learn now is that it's not just Das. Because if it was Das, you could still argue that Chachma and Bina then are somewhat outside of the process. Chachma and Bina are basically necessary to lead you to a place like that. But do Chachma and Bina themselves also experience it? And the answer is going to be yes. That there's a level of Bina, which he doesn't, which when I just read, he doesn't talk about that level of Bina. There's a level of Bina through Das, that Bina itself, and clearly also Chachma, reach a place that connects to Arich and Atik that can never have been connected, can never have happened without Das. So think of it on a physical level. You could have a father and a mother, a spouse, husband and wife. They love each other. But if they're not intimate, if they don't have Das, Odom Yodos Chavo, what are they going to have? A lot of love. The intimacy is going to be the one that actually creates, first of all, a deeper connection, but also a qualitatively deeper connection, and also will give birth. Without that, they can love each other day to tomorrow. If they're not intimate, I'm talking about even physically, they're not going to give birth. The same thing is in Ruchnius. Chachma and Bina are the seeds, the seed, and the development of the idea, the very ingredients of what you're contemplating on and developing. Das creates the connection, that intimate connection, but then Chachma and Bina also become more intimate. Das is not outside of Chachma. Das is creating the intimacy that Chachma and Bina should also relate in an intimate way to godliness. And intimate here means a connection to Staklus in Metzach of Arich, the gazing at the forehead, the Ratzon of Ratzon Hashem, which includes what's behind the Metzach Atik, the Shin Ayin Nehur, the Ayin Hey Nehur, the 370 Shin Ayin Nehurin, the 370 lights of Atik. Yeah.
Simon, I cannot find it. You said page 1275. So that's Reish Ayin Hey, right?
I said Kuf Ayin. I said 1175.
Ah.
Volume 2, not in volume 3.
Thank you. That's why we have the concept Bar Das, even a very big.
Yeah.
Bar Das is so important. Not Bar Chochma, Bar Bina.
Yeah, but the main thing I wanted to explain is this point now, the Bina Das connection, which he's going to refer to, but I think it's important to spell out, so I spelled it out. I would go a step further even. Remember, we learned that it's not just that the Moichin is giving birth to the Midas, to the emotions, and nurturing them and maturing them and guiding them, etc. But the Midas also catapult the Moichin, the Ima, that's the Shalach Tishalach Hasa'im, that because of the Afrechim, because of the Midas that are now in a state that they actually are springboard that catapult Bina back to Atzmis Habina. Now, how are Midas born? Through Iskashus. Remember, the process began the other way around. Father and mother, Chachma and Bina, through Das, intimacy, give birth to the emotions. The emotions then are taken care of by Bina. Bina is taking care of them, guiding them. So Bina has to go down a level to essentially educate and train the emotions. As the emotions get developed and matured, they now come alive and they're far more refined. They're not just purely instinctive or reflexive, and definitely not just about self-interest. So the emotions now are relating to godliness, to higher levels of godliness, because Binah trained them and taught them about that level of those higher levels of godliness, comprehension, like we learned about Mamala Kalam and Sevav Kalam, and we learned about Kula Kamei Kala Chashiv, that how God is beyond existence, even levels beyond that, how God is completely beyond. All that caused the emotions to become stimulated and grown and matured. She's talking about mature emotions. Those emotions were born through Chachma Binah together with Das. Now, what's happening is the emotions, which are a result of that, are in turn feeding that and leading everything back upward, back to the source, which is Arich and Atik. So what you really have here is a fascinating combination. Now, each one, Chachma does its thing, which we learned before, is like Riyah, recognition, and so on. Chachma has, if you want a difference between Chachma and Das, by the way, he talks about that also in Ayin Beis in volume 2. Das is the end of the process. Chachma is the beginning of the process, remember. So the Chachma, the Nekudas HaChachma, does have a sense of emes, because it's the closest thing to Keser. But there is still a seed, it's not developed. In Das is like the end of the process, where you understand the idea, now you connect to the idea, so Das will feed something back, so Midas and Das will feed something back to Binah, to Chachma and to Binah, and together they now can experience mind and heart. Mind, intellect, and emotions can experience a higher presence of the divine that we're discussing here. I think that's the way to really round it out. So he says, so here's the parentheses, which is what I already explained. I just explained it before we read it. So here's what he says. And according to what it says in Tanya, chapter 50, so he's referring back to the chapter on the top of the page, or actually the bottom of last page. Sefer Shabbenim Perek Nun. Remember there, the Rebbe Rashab said that when you look at the three levels, when a person contemplates on godliness and the greatness of God, so they come to a thirst, to chelas nefesh, to chelas ava, chelas ava, love sickness, that actually impacts them in like a person who's got sick with love, and kleisa nefesh. So he said, mashma, not mashma, lifia moving sham, even kleisa nefesh is all part of the fire. It's all part of the fiery passion. Not like water of ava b'tainugim, which is shuv. It's all part of the passion. However, it's the level of passion that leads you to complete bittul. So the Rebbe Rashab is referring back to that Tanya now. He said, this level of bittul that we're talking about, pnimius, atzmis, the pnimius of atzmis. So in Tanya there, as I learned it inside, he says it's Zov, the mile of Zov, l'gaba kesef. Meaning gold, which is greater, Bina, greater than Kesef. Kesef is the Kohen Chesed. Zov is Levi Bina. So according to the Tanya, it comes from Bina, this level of Kleis HaNefesh. L'fize Yuvan, the Ime Yesha, L'fi Hanal. According to this, it's understood that even though L'fi Hanal, Ikrahu Mibchinas Hadas, didn't we say before that all this is coming from Das? Because Das is the Hiskashrus. From Tanya, it appears that Bina is the vital component here, because the Kleis HaNefesh is coming from Bina. Nevertheless, it comes from Bina. I'll explain what he means here in a moment. Like he says in Tanya, explicitly in Tanya, it's coming from Bina. And look what it says in the Ve'ela Shmeis, which I have to look up. But what is he saying here? It seems like a contradiction of terms here. He says, according to the Tanya, it's coming from Bina. Lefize Yuvan, what's Yuvan? What do we understand? That even though Iker is from Das, it still comes from Bina. So the answer is quite straightforward. Bina is the contemplation. Das is not a contemplation. Das is a connection. So Bina is the place where you get that passion when a person really contemplates on something that's negei b'nafshe, that touches him so deeply, so it causes a deep passion, a deep bittul. But Das is critical, because if he didn't feel connected to it, the Bina wouldn't do that. So both of them are necessary. That's how I would explain this piece here. That Binah creates that type of passion, but it's Das that creates the connection between you and the thing that Binah is understanding. Now, he doesn't say this explicitly. He just says, so is it Das or Binah? So this is the way I would explain it. That Das provides the connection between you and the thing that Binah is understanding, and Binah is the actual ingredients of what you're understanding that generates that type of passion. So in other words, if you didn't have Das, you wouldn't have that level of connection, personal. If you wouldn't have Binah, you'd have connection, but you wouldn't have understanding, which is critical to this whole discussion, that the person actually understands and appreciates the gravity of this level of connection to godliness in this core essential level, as I explained before. So basically, you can't have Das without Chachma and Binah, essentially. You can't, because what is it going to do? It's kashrus to what? Das is a power, tremendous power of recognition. But what do you recognize? First, you have to know what you're talking about. Then you can say, okay, now I recognize it's mine. It belongs to me. It's my father. It's my personal experience. So I'm going to stop here at the end of this parentheses, but let's take any questions or comments if anybody would like to address.
Yeah, he's saying in Perek Gimel that the Binah is mainly the midas, but you need the Das.
What are you talking about? He's saying Sham is Perek Nun. He's not talking about Perek Gimel here.
That's not in Perek Gimel, that the Binah is mainly the midas.
I just explained last 15 minutes this parenthesis.
No, your explanation was fascinating.
No. What's that? If you were listening, look at the first line of the parentheses. What does he say? What?
Yeah.
That's Perek Nun. That's not Perek Gimel. He's not talking about Perek Gimel here. He's not talking about Perek Gimel here. I mentioned Perek Gimel. In Perek Gimel, he does not say that Binah creates Ava Kadish Be'esh Kles HaNefesh. In Perek Nun, he says that. In Perek Gimel, there's no question. There would be no shaila in Perek Gimel. Perek Gimel, Chachma Binah, and you must have Das to give birth to Midas. That's clear. That's not the discussion.
But in Perek Gimel, he's saying that the Midas are to from the Binah.
I suggest you re-listen to what I just explained. We're not talking about Perek Gimel here. Perek Gimel, there's no issue in Perek Gimel. Here's a question on the table. What creates the Kles HaNefesh, that element of total bittul? Is it Binah or Das? We're not talking about that in Perek Gimel. Perek Gimel is not talking about total bittul. In Perek Gimel, he's just talking about the birth of Midas. You need to have. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself, but this parenthesis is about Perek Nun, not about Perek Gimel, which is relevant to our discussion here, the total bittul that comes through the Kles HaNefesh and Kiloyin, bittul Mikol Mitziyuseh. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Perek Nun is a lot higher than Perek Gimel is just the introduction to the idea that you need Chachma Binah Das for Midas. Perek Nun is where you talk about the level that he refers to Kenekuda, the Les Bachivre, the Chikud, the Chimu. So look, essentially that's what he's talking about here. Okay, I'll have to look up the Eilish Mes. Any other questions? No other questions? Everything is so clear. Okay. I'll look up the Eilish Mes. I want to see what he says there. I'll look it up later. So with that, so I'm going to stop here. The end of the parentheses on page 1247, the new paragraph. And it's not finished yet. There's more.